You may not know her name, but you know her from Norman Rockwell's iconic painting, The Problem We All Live With. It shows Ruby Bridges, a little black girl, walking to her first day of school in 1960 in New Orleans, surrounded by 4 very tall white U.S. Marshals, amid signs of protest and fearful ignorance. Robert Coles, a distinguished child psychiatrist of that time, was quite concerned about the effect that the hatred and prejudice that accompanied Ruby's desegregation of the all-white school would have on her for the rest of her life. He knew as a psychiatrist that she was probably having trouble eating, sleeping, and carrying on with her normal routines. Every day he interviewed her and would ask, "Ruby, how are you sleeping?" She would reply, "I'm sleeping just fine." Coles would pursue the question, "Then I bet you aren't eating very well, are you?" She would reply, "I'm eating just fine." Every day he would ask the questions and she would respond in the same way, "I'm just fine." Finally, one day he heard Ruby's teacher say that she had noticed that Ruby seemed to be talking to herself as she walked through the angry mob that gathered outside the school to protest her being there. Dr. Coles asked Ruby what she was saying as she walked through the line of angry people. She told him, "I say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Little Ruby Bridges, speaking the same words that Jesus uttered from the cross as he was dying, praying for forgiveness for those who rejected him. Our scriptures today focused on forgiveness. In our reading from the Hebrew scriptures, Sirach warns us that if we are vengeful, we will suffer God's vengeance. Sirach insists that it is our own need of forgiveness from God that should prompt us to grant the same forgiveness to others, and not whether others have earned our forgiveness. Jesus takes forgiveness to an even deeper level. Our gospel passage is in 2 sections. First, Peter asks Jesus how many times he must forgive his brother. Rabbis at the time taught that you must forgive another 3 times. So Peter, in an effort to show that he is learning something about Jesus' mission, suggests not twice 3, but even once more for 7 times. 7, that perfect mystical number. Jesus has more to teach him, however, and Jesus says, no, not 7 times, but rather, and here the Greek can be translated as either 77 times or 70 times 7 for 490 times. The hyperbole is clear. We are not to set a limit on how many times we forgive someone, for we are forgiven repeatedly. We are to forgive as we have been forgiven. The brilliant preacher, Methodist Bishop William Willimon, describes Jesus' lesson this way: put away your calculator. It isn't about math. It isn't about keeping score. Forgiveness is an attitude, a way of life, Peter. It's a matter of the heart. The second part of Jesus' lesson on forgiveness comes in the form of a parable, but the hyperbole continues. A king is owed 10,000 talents by his servant. This is an incredible amount of money, since 1 talent of silver was worth 15 years' wages for a menial laborer, or around $150 million. It is too ridiculously large a sum to make sense in any circumstance, but the amount is meant to indicate an inconceivable debt. Otherwise, the parable does not bring the point home. The servant does not ask that the debt be forgiven, but rather that he be released in order to pay off the debt, something he would never be able to do in several lifetimes. The king is so moved, however, that he not only releases the servant, but also forgives him his entire debt. The servant is set free from jail and from all obligation to repay what he owed the king. But then, the servant who has been so graciously forgiven confronts his fellow servant, who owes him 100 denarii, or roughly 3 months' wages, not 15 years' wages. The contrast is one that amounts to exaggeration. The second servant's death was only 1/600,000th of what the first servant owed the king. Jesus draws a connection between the generosity of the king and the generosity of God. The debt owed to both of them can never be repaid. We who correspond to the debtors have this compassion as an example after which we should pattern our relationships with one another. The way of God is the way of forgiveness, and what it calls us to is a new way of viewing the world. We may think that the process of forgiveness and reconciliation begins with the offender repenting of the offense and then asking for forgiveness. But in fact, the opposite is true. The process must begin with the one offended offering forgiveness, and this willingness to forgive transforming one from being a victim to being a survivor. Furthermore, such magnanimity is what may touch a heart of the offender who may be so transformed to no longer being an offender, but becoming a friend. Jesus' wonderful parable of the prodigal son demonstrates how God's forgiveness always precedes our repentance. Remember how the son came to his senses, as the gospel says, and prepared a little confessional speech? Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Treat me as one of your paid servants. We can only imagine how many hundreds of times he rehearsed these words as he traveled home. And what happened when the father sees him? He doesn't wait for him to come crawling home, to come groveling for forgiveness. He runs to him. And before the son can finish his little apology, the father has embraced him and is busy giving orders to his servants to prepare a homecoming banquet. If we had no other words of Jesus but this one parable, we would have the full teaching of Jesus on the boundlessness of God's love for us. Such is the kingdom of heaven, where all sins are forgiven by an incalculably gracious God. But wait. What about those who aren't sorry? Those who don't recognize or take ownership for their sins? Does God forgive them too? Does God's forgiveness extend to all people, even the most egregious of sinners? What about Hitler? What about Stalin? Dictators who killed millions of people? What about sex traffickers, drug dealers, pedophiles? Isn't there a place of punishment? Isn't there a hell for these horrific sinners? Well, I look at it in a very simple way. If we say God is omnipresent, which means God is everywhere, then doesn't that mean that God has to be in hell? But how can it be hell if God is there? Perhaps in eternity, God is present to all people, just as God is present to all people while we are here on earth. But just as some people live their lives here on earth with an awareness of God's presence and love, and others live without knowing or caring about God's presence, perhaps in heaven, the just turn to face God, and God's glory is reflected in them. At the same time, the unjust turn away from God has been their habit all through their lifetime. Facing away from the glory of God, all they can see is the darkness of their own shadow, and they spend eternity in isolation, staring into emptiness. God's love and mercy, God's forgiveness and healing are always there for us, but we must open our hearts and our lives to receive these gifts. Then, having been forgiven, healed, and set free, we are called to do the same for others and pray with gratitude and courage. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing.